Hello, everyone. Thanks for coming in. We'll get started in just a minute. Okay, thanks everyone for joining us this afternoon, and welcome to today's episode of the EU Renew webinar series on Europe in the World. I'm Carrie Ottoburn of the Leuven Center for Global Governance Studies, and I will be your host and moderator. Today, we are joined by Professor Philip Schleifer, who will be discussing his new book, Global Shifts, Business Politics, and Deforestation in a Changing World Economy, which was published earlier this year by MIT Press. Professor Philip Schleifer is Associate Professor of Transnational Governance at the Political Science Department at the University of Amsterdam. His research focuses on the politics and governance of sustainability in the global economy. His work investigates the effectiveness and transparency of voluntary standards in global value chains, the design of hybrid biofuel governance in the European Union, and the political economy of sustainable commodity production in emerging economies, among other things. Also joining us today as expert discussant is Professor Elizabeth Bennett. Elizabeth is the Joseph M. Ha Associate Professor of International Affairs and Program Director of Political Economy at Lewis and Clark College in Portland, Oregon. She is focused on how non-governmental actors address labor exploitation in global supply chains. In particular, she examines how NGOs and businesses develop creative solutions to uneven distribution of profit in supply chains, including through voluntary sustainability certifications, fair trade, social enterprises, and profit sharing. We will begin today's webinar with a presentation by Philip of approximately 30 minutes, and then we'll turn over to Elizabeth to kick off the discussion. She can offer some reflections and ask a few questions, and Philip will have an opportunity to respond. Then we will turn to questions from you, the audience. So feel free to send questions for the speakers at any point during the webinar using the webinar Q&A function. You can find it at the bottom of the Zoom window. You just click on that and send your questions through that Q&A box. I will collect your questions to share with the speakers during the audience Q&A during the end of the presentations. Before we begin, just a few quick words about the EU Renew project. That is the host of this webinar today. The EU Research and Education Network on Europe and the World, or EU Renew as we call it, is an Erasmus Germany network bringing together 19 higher education institutions from Europe, Asia, Africa, and the Americas, with the goal of improving knowledge and enhancing debate on the EU's role in an ever-changing world. On behalf of EU Renew, I would like to thank Philip and Elizabeth for joining us today. It is now my great pleasure to pass the floor over to Philip.
All right. Thank you so much, Carrie. I will just open my presentation. All right, thank you so much for the kind introduction and also for the invitation. So I'm very happy to be here and to give a talk based on my new book, as mentioned, titled Global Shifts, Business Politics and Deforestation in a Changing World Economy, which was published earlier this summer. And in this talk, I want to kind of give you an overview of kind of what this book is about and its main features. But before I delve into the contents, I also wanted to just say a few words about the genesis of the project. And I think with book projects, it is sometimes a little bit difficult to really kind of clearly delineate and determine retrospectively when the thinking and work really started. So this is a book that really draws on my long-standing interest and research on sustainability and governance in agri-food supply chains, starting with my PhD studies about a decade ago. But the idea to really bring this together in a book in this particular form, I think was something that really started to take shape somewhere around 2017 when I wrote a proposal and pitched the idea for the book to the MIT Environmental Studies acquisition editor. And to my great delight, she supported the idea and supported the project. And was what followed was really quite a bit of hard work, I have to say. And I've also been a bit overly optimistic about the timeline, but I think this is also a very common feature of book projects that they that they tend to take a lot longer than you think or would like them to. There was light and shadow during the research and writing process, including a global pandemic. And there were moments during which I thought, okay, this book will never see the light of day, but ultimately, luckily, it did. And also, thanks to amazing support I had on the way from people around me, family, friends, and also colleagues. I'm really grateful for that. And I'm just very happy to be here today and to give this presentation. All right, so let me delve into the contents of the book. I think it's impossible, of course, to compress an entire book into a shortish presentation like this one. So I'm not going to attempt that. So don't be afraid. I will kind of constrain myself here and talk about three main things. So first of all, I want to take a little bit of time to talk about the substantive problem or the research problem this book is concerned about. So also for those of you in the audience that might be less familiar with a subject matter, and then I will use this to introduce and motivate the central question of the book and outline its empirical or its theoretical analytical approach and contribution. And lastly, I also would like to take a little bit of time to highlight a few from findings and insights from the empirical analysis of the book. So let me start with the research problem or the substantive problem this book is concerned with, and this is the issue of commodity-driven deforestation. And I'm sure many of you will be familiar with this, at least to some extent. So agricultural expansion is one of the key sources and drivers of deforestation around the world, and it is also linked to global greenhouse gas emissions and biodiversity loss as a result of this. And to make this a bit more tangible, to illustrate this further, I have here on the slide a map of the island of Borneo, which is part of Southeast Asia's Malay archipelago, with the northern part of the island belonging to Malaysia and the southern part to Indonesia, also known as Kalimantan. And Borneo is, in fact, Southeast Asia's largest island. So it's approximately 20 times the size of the Netherlands, so my country of residence, so which gives you an idea of the spatial dimensions we're talking here about. And as you can see from the slide, until the mid-1970s or so, the island was almost completely covered in rainforest. But then over subsequent decades, beginning in the 1980s and accelerating further in the 1990s and 2000s, there was a massive forest clearing on Borneo. And in the case of Borneo, it was mainly driven by the expansion of industrial oil palm plantations. But commodity-driven deforestation is not a process that is limited to Borneo or the palm oil sector. So this is also happening in other industries and geographies. And there's also an important transnational dimension to the problem, as these commodities are linked to global supply chains, as they are often highly traded commodities. And this also links companies in these chains directly or indirectly to these land use change processes. And these transnational connections, this transnational dimension has, of course, not gone unnoticed. So there has been lots of campaigning over the years on the issue of commodity-driven deforestation. And there's been a lot of pressure piling up on, in particular, lead firms in agri-food supply chains, big brand companies, about their exposure to deforestation and the deforestation that is ultimately contained in their supply chains and products. So much pressure that they felt to compelled to act also collectively. And a very important moment here was the 2010 Global Climate Summit in Cancun. And at the summit, the members of the Consumer Goods Forum made a commitment or pledge to eliminate deforestation from their supply chains by 2020. And at the summit, this zero deforestation pledge was prominently announced by Muta Ken from Coca-Cola, whom you can see here on the slide. And to achieve their commitments, these companies have also partnered up with major environmental organizations, particularly the WWF, which had already in previous years worked with various stakeholders in key commodity sectors to create certification mechanisms, in particular the Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil and the Roundtable on Responsible Soy. They're two important initiatives which also feature in the analysis of the book. In 2010, when the Consumer Goods Forum made its zero deforestation pledge, was actually also the year I started my PhD studies. And as a student of transnational business governance, I was really intrigued by this development and also this kind of, optimistic spirit about this new private sector initiative and the prospect that these companies could use their enormous economic clout to actually help address problems around commodity-driven deforestation in places like Borneo and in other geographies. But moving fast forward in time to 2020, many analysts are actually somewhat disillusioned about the progress that has been achieved, and some analysts even went as far as calling the impact of the deforestation-free supply chain movement elusive. There was also this perception of this kind of dawning failed market transformation, which motivated the analysis for this book. And what you can see here on the slide is a figure from the first chapter, which on the one hand shows global annual tree cover loss linked to commodity-driven deforestation in million hectares, and on the other hand, these arrows here signal important milestones in the development of this global supply chain movement. And we can see here that over the past 20 years and also in the over the 2010s, despite all these commitments and pledges and initiatives, the rate of commodity-driven deforestation globally has remained stubbornly high. So admittedly, this figure, I think, simplifies things a bit too much. So there's also now research showing that progress has been achieved in some supply chain settings, but overall there's a sense that these companies have not really achieved or reached their zero deforestation commitments, and that commodity-driven deforestation and also trade-driven deforestation really remains a pressing environmental problem. So looking at the question of the effectiveness of transnational business governance, I in the book discuss two main approaches or two main perspectives, which really have helped us understand better the conditions under what these initiatives can be successful or can have an impact or influence behavioral outcomes. And one important perspective is here what I refer to as the institutionalist approach. So these are research works that are rooted in political science and public policy research on private environmental programs and certification programs, for instance. And an important focus in this literature are questions of institutional design. So studies would look at how, for instance, the stringency of standards of these programs or the design of their monitoring and enforcement mechanisms, how this relates to behavioral outcomes. In addition to that, there's also what I broadly refer to as the impact evaluation literature. So this is quite a vast and broad literature uniting contributions from geographers, sociologists, economists, development scholars. And one important focus in the literature is also the assessment of so-called environmental benefits of certification programs, but also more recently, these zero deforestation commitments. And on the one hand, this involves studies that engage in ex-ante quantifications of their potential effects or expected effects. So these studies would, for instance, model what would be the expected reduction in deforestation if all companies in an industry or supply chain setting would adhere to a certain sustainability standard. But this literature also involves studies that really assess the actually realized biophysical impacts of these initiatives. So, for instance, studies that would compare the deforestation rate of certified and non-certified plantations, for instance. And I describe in the book how these approaches have really greatly advanced our understanding of questions of effectiveness, but there are also limitations. And one such limitation I discuss is the tendency to assess effectiveness in the context of rather narrowly construed institutional boundaries. And it is here where this book aims to contribute by broadening the analysis beyond such more traditional concerns with institutional effectiveness. And more specifically, the book here puts the focus on the macro political economic context from which transnational regulatory authority emerges and in which it is exercised. And it picks up here a long-standing critique by political economist Susan Strange, who already in the 1980s criticized the institutionalist research program for overemphasizing the static and underemphasizing the dynamic elements of change in the world economy. And the book sets out to address this blind spot, so to speak, by situating transnational business governance in the context of contemporary globalization, by situating this supply chain movement in this broader context. And specifically, it puts here the focus on a large structural trend that has been playing out for some time, which is the shift in the world's economic center of gravity away from the global north. And this is also a process that is unfolding in the world food economy, where we see the creation of a new geography of trade and consumption over the past decade or so. And against this background, the central research question that this book motivates is: how are new configurations of power in the global economy shaping the politics and governance of major agricultural supply chains, as well as their environmental consequences? And I argue that ontologically, a political economy approach is very well positioned to address this question, because such an approach allows analysis of effectiveness beyond more narrowly conceived institutional boundaries and environmental benefits. Peter Newell writes, for instance, that students of political economy and the environment cast the analytical net more widely. So they are interested in understanding the reasons for why environmental crises persist despite unprecedented levels of governance. And against this background, the book sets out to discuss different political economy perspectives with a particular focus on works related to sustainability and sustainability governance. So it discusses the IPE literature, the comparative political economy literature, and global value chain analysis as well. And it shows that each of these perspectives really allows important insights into the question at hand. So for instance, the perspective of international political economy is very well suited to shed light on the big picture questions of how global change processes link to environmental problems, but also manifestations of governance authority in the world economy. And in addition to that, and complementing that, a comparative political economy approach and value chain analysis really allow for more fine-grained analysis of how these processes then play out across industry sectors, but also in the context of global supply chains. And to unlock the full potential of these perspectives, the full analytical potential, the book then develops a multi-level framework of analysis that combines them in a layered approach. And this layered approach from the global to the sectoral to the value chain is then carried out in the the second part of the book in the empirical chapters. And the empirical analysis of the book consists of three main chapters, really, which, as I mentioned before, draw on my research work spanning the past decade on agri-food supply chains. There's a primary focus in these chapters on the palm oil sector and palm oil supply chain, in particular Indonesia, and a secondary focus on the soy sector and soy supply chain and Brazil. And these chapters draw on interviews that I conducted with key stakeholders and informants that are connected to these industries. They also draw on field trips to Indonesia and India, the world's largest producer and emerging market consumer of palm oil, and also on participant observations during various policy, practitioner and industry events over the years. And the chapters also digest a large amount of primary documentation of all sorts, and they also rely on trade data, supply chain data, and deforestation data. And to make sense of this rich body of material, they employ research methodologies that are linked to the different political economy perspectives that I just outlined. So in particular, historical structural analysis brought from international political economy research, comparative case study analysis, but also value chain mapping and analysis. So I will now take a few minutes in the reminder of the talk to also highlight a few findings from the empirical part of the book. And the book really opens the analysis by revisiting a major debate in the IPE and the international political economy literature on economic globalization and environmental degradation. And critical political economists have argued that globalization has had significant negative environmental consequences, that it has fueled environmental crises resulting from the expansion of an extractivist and also consumption-driven economic model. And the book revisits that relationship in the case of commodity-driven deforestation. And it describes and shows how this link between globalization and deforestation remains quite strong in 21st century agricultural trade. And to illustrate this a little bit with data, I have here a figure from one of the chapters of the book, which displays data on traded deforestation, or more precisely, the deforestation risk that is contained in trade relationships. And the focus is here on the deforestation risk that is connected to the trade of soy and palm oil. And we can see here from the figure how historically the European Union has been by far the largest driver of deforestation in the trade of these commodities. But we can also see how over the 2010s, so over the period of that zero deforestation supply chain agenda, emerging economies, in particular China and India, how their impact, deforestation impact in these commodities has increased very strongly, and how over the subsequent years, these emerging economies increasingly replace the European Union as the main driver of these processes, as the center of trade and consumption shifts away from the global north over that decade in these commodity sectors. Having said that, I think it's also really important to highlight here historical contributions, right? So historically speaking, of course, advanced economies have been the main drivers, deforestation drivers, and also today, even though their deforestation footprint has come down, consumption in the EU, of course, also still is linked to significant amounts of deforestation around the world, as this graph here also shows. Against this background, the book also analyzes how the existing system of transnational business governance, so these various certification programs, but also zero deforestation commitments made by companies. So how are they adapting to these market shifts? And here one of the chapters conducts a comparative analysis of the uptake of transnational sustainability standards across major forest risk commodities. And an overall observation is that their uptake has grown very strongly in the over the 2010s, which you can also see here illustrated on the slide with a figure that focuses on certification-based standards over a basket of highly traded agricultural commodities. There are also significant differences between sectors. The book takes sort of a deep dive into the soy and palm oil sectors to show how these differences in uptake can be explained with variation in their sectoral political economies. However, there's also another important overarching trend which I highlight, which is the growing incongruence between the location of these certified supply chains and the new geography of trade and consumption. And even the most successful of these private governance organizations are really struggling to gain uptake in these new markets. And one example, which I've also researched and covered in previous research, is the Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil. So globally, a very mature and established certification program, which today certifies some 90% of the palm oil imports of the European Union. But when we look at its uptake in China and India, it remains still rather marginal. So it's somewhere around 5% or even less. And I argue that this really limits the macro effectiveness of these established private governance organizations as these incongruencies persist. But more is a foot here. So the analysis also shows how processes of contemporary globalization are really reconfiguring the structure of agricultural commodity chains. So in addition to global north-south supply chains, they're expanding regional supply chains, connecting producer countries to large or fast expanding markets in Asia, in particular India and China, in the case of palm oil, and often overlooked entirely in the transnational business governance literature. They're also really fast expanding domestic supply chains. So when we take the case of palm oil in Indonesia, domestic consumption has here seen by far the most significant growth over the past decade. But this is often overlooked, and in this case, it was in particular driven by the expansion of a national biofuels program that used palm oil as one of the primary feedstock, really. And this restructuration also has wider implications for power, politics, and governance in these chains. And the book sets out to canvas the shifting terrain of sustainability governance in these polycentric or multipolar value chains. So it shows how, in response to this global north-driven zero deforestation supply chain movement, how actors in the producer countries have have responded in an attempt to renationalize sustainability governance, creating their own standards and certification schemes, sometimes in competition to those of the global north. And the book argues that these shifts in economic power are actually a very important background condition that help us understand the nature of their interactions. So this is, of course, also a topic that has received a lot of attention in scholarship in recent years. And in addition to that, the book also looks at what is going on in these fast-growing regional markets, in particular China and India. One example that is being discussed in the book in more detail is the so-called India Sustainable Palm Oil Coalition. So this is an effort bringing together various actors to try to advocate for sustainable sourcing policies in the Indian market. And there's also a similar initiative existing in China called the China Sustainable Palm Oil Alliance. And the book looks at these new policy coalitions, but that research also suggests that there's still a very long way to go to move these vast markets to more sustainable sourcing, and that coalitions that are powerful enough to do so have yet to emerge. But overall, this is a very fast developing governance arena. It's definitely much faster than academic book publishing, and there have also been a number of more recent important policy initiatives. And one that I discuss in more detail in the book as part of a kind of forward-looking research agenda are so-called jurisdictional approaches to zero deforestation. So these are attempts to strengthen local institutions and local governance networks right there in the places and the jurisdictions where the commodities are being produced. And I discussed the opportunities and challenges of these initiatives. And overall, I think that despite significant challenges they face, it is an important focus, in particular in a world in which we actually see that more of the consumption in trade is actually happening domestically and regionally. And then, of course, there's the much talked about shift to more mandatory regulatory approaches in the European Union. And also in this policy field, the EU actually enacted earlier this year a supply chain regulation, the EU Deforestation Regulation. And of course, this is also the focus of much exciting research. And perhaps that is also something we can come back to in the discussion and try to make sense of it also against the background of the analytical perspective outlined in the book. All right, so yeah, let me come to a close here, or bring this presentation to an end by just briefly highlighting the key features of the book. So this book really sets out to direct attention to changing global political economy structures and processes in research on transnational business governance effectiveness, and it charts the environmental consequences of contemporary globalization in the case of commodity-driven deforestation. And against that background, it reveals the structural limitations of global north-south supply chain initiatives in 21st century agricultural trade. And further, it sets out to map the changing terrain of sustainability politics and governance in important forest risk commodity sectors. And perhaps just briefly, before I hand over to the discussant, as I said initially, it is impossible to, of course, compress the contents of a book in a presentation like this. So there's, of course, more nuance to the theoretical argument and also the empirical story than I was able to cover here. So if you would like to read more, the book is available as a paperback at all major online booksellers. And also, and I'm very happy about that, it has been included in the Direct to Open initiative of MIT Libraries. So all the chapters are actually available for free and can be downloaded using this link here on the website. But I will just leave it at that and then hand over to Elizabeth. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Philip, for this extremely interesting overview of the key background of your book, the theoretical background, and also some of the empirics. Of course, now we have to read the book to get the rest of those, but I think that's a good teaser. So hopefully everyone will navigate to that link after this. But now I'd like to pass off the floor to Elizabeth to kick off today's discussion. And I would also like to quickly remind the audience that the Q&A will begin fairly soon. And so feel free to send me your questions for the Q&A via the Q&A box at the bottom of the Zoom window. Over to you, Elizabeth.
Right. Thank you so much for a great presentation and the opportunity to comment. First, I want to congratulate Philip on a remarkable book. The research design is innovative and smart. The 3 levels of analysis go brilliantly together to take an IPE lens for power and politics in the global economy, and the comparative political economy lens to allow us to use differences between 2 commodities to learn about them. And then the value chain analysis revealing how particular commodities organization change how voluntary sustainability standards and certifications manifest. So clearly a decade of research has generated a rich body of primary data, and your familiarity with the literature allows you to stand on the shoulders of the giants in our field and make an important contribution. So congratulations on a fantastic book. What we knew before this book and what the book affirms is that we are not living in early era globalization. This is not 2002. The landscape of voluntary sustainability standards is not defined by a few large European-based NGO ignited organizations. The world is not divided into supplier or demander countries. Civil society organizations in the West are no longer intimately connected to the firms that are purchasing products, to the consumer base that are pressuring those firms, and to the political institutions that are creating legislation in which they operate. So we knew that, and the book affirms in such a clear way what that looks like. What we didn't understand until now, until your book, was to what extent and how exactly this changing context is really altering how certifications are organized and how their new organization has serious consequences for sustainability outcomes on the ground. And this couldn't be more important. It shows us why continuing on the path we've been on is not going to take us to the destination we want to go. So I'm honored to be invited to ignite today's discussion with a few thoughts, and I've got 2 questions for you. My first question is about the shift in problems. So you argue that the problem in the 90s to maybe the 2010s was uptake. So there's a few voluntary sustainability standards. Their standards were rigorous enough, you argue, that if they were widely adopted, goals would be achieved. So the core challenge there was, how do we get lead firms to insist that producers adopt these standards and become certified? And the conversation was really about uptake. And you show us how now the core challenge is really about governance, that value chains are organized differently. Certifications are emerging to adopt to these new forms of organization. And in this way, it's not the matter of knowing what the standards are, who the certifiers are, who the lead firms are, and just getting them to do something, but it's a question of who is in charge, where are the standards being set, and for whom and by whom. So in this way, what you're describing as the current situation for soy and palm reminds me so much of what fair trade has looked like for the last couple of decades. The fair trade certification landscape has been, to use your word, really fragmented. There are standards coming out in the 90s from every different country had their own standards. They largely consolidated in the late 90s. And then in the 2000s, we started to see the emergence of more and more standards. What's happened in fair trade with that fractured landscape is a race to the bottom, an incentive for companies to play a much bigger role than they ever have before in creating own brand standards or creating business association standards to compete with those that emerge from NGOs. So all of this to say, as I read how you chart the shift from the problem is uptake to the problem is governance, and I think about the fair trade story, I wonder for you, what do you see as stopping this new fractured landscape from looking like fair trade, where there are many, many, many labels, they're competing, own brand and NGO labels are side by side. It's hard to tell whose is whose. Consumers are confused. Companies are pulling out from the more rigorous standards. So that's where we've been with fair trade? Is that where we're headed in other commodities too? Would I read your story to suggest that that's where we're going? I hope not. And if not, why? And that would be lovely and optimistic. And if so, is there anything that can be done to prevent some of those pitfalls? And my second question is about governance in the new certifications. So you highlighted in the book, and you didn't have a chance to get to it in the presentation, that some of the new certifications for South-South and regional supply chains and domestic supply chains are saying really interesting, important things about how they might include smallholder farmers in government and governance, how they might include indigenous groups, how those who have been marginalized from global voluntary sustainability standards in this iteration, in this new moment, are really going to be brought into governance. And you've got some examples of what those claims sound like. And then at the same time, you say, but on the other hand, there's the potential for this to be really local government and local elites working together, and to not make good on those promises, and to have more elite capture. And so my question there is, where do you see the role of civil society in this new moment? Are indigenous groups and NGOs pushing their way in and demanding their right to be heard, and for the new certifications to make good on the promise of inclusion of marginalized groups? Or do we understand it to be mostly window dressing? So optimistically, this is an opportunity to include groups that have never governed value chains. And pessimistically, it's more window dressing for top-down elite governance. And again, as in the previous question, I very much hope that you've got evidence for the optimistic answer, but want to hear a little bit about where you see this heading. And then finally, if you have any updates since publishing the book that you want to share about due diligence legislation, or how the continuation of post-pandemic global economy shifts have changed the story that you wrote about in the book, those are invited. So thank you so much. And anything further that you want to share is so welcome, but a few ideas to get the conversation started.
You, Philip.
Right. Thank you so much, Elizabeth, for taking the time to read the book, and for your praise, and but also criticism and these challenging questions. They're really great. Yeah, let me just try to tackle them. So your first question was about the fragmentation of sustainability governance that I describe in the book, and you compared this what you in the past have observed in the field of fair trade standards, right? And whether or not there's kind of a high road or a low road, and how they could look like, and how can we get to the high road of not ending up in a world where we see ever more fragmentation and a race to the bottom. So I think an important distinction in the book is that the fragmentation that I describe is also happening more across north-south lines, and perhaps not so much between kind of NGO and business lines, or different NGOs and different business actors. So I think that was a very familiar fragmentation story in the past. But we also perhaps have now another dimension to that fragmentation story, if you like, which is more actors in different jurisdictions, the kind of traditional consumer countries in the global north and their standards and initiatives, then also the producer countries that really have become much more active as standard setters because of concerns over national sovereignty and other issues, developing their own systems, but also developments in other large emerging markets, right? So I think the kind of fragmentation story has even become much more fragmented or complex. And of course, this also increases much more, or makes it much more challenging to really, achieve more coherence in this. And I think one interesting development, and perhaps this also links a little bit to kind of the last question you ask, is indeed due diligence regulation in the global north. In this case, the EU deforestation regulation, which I think, at least when it comes to the voluntary sustainability standards, the various standards that already exist, I think there is, it is likely that they will somehow converge towards that regulation, right? So I think it might have a kind of fragmentation reducing effect in certain parts of that voluntary sustainability standards landscape. I think another important question here is also how the standards and initiatives that now have been developed in the producer countries. So for instance, when we take Indonesia, they have the Indonesia Sustainable Palm Oil Program, a national standard. So how will those standards relate to the EU deforestation regulation? I think that's a very important and thorny question. And so far we have seen that the EU, I think, has taken a somewhat unilateral approach, kind of imposing its regulation and its standard, also creating all kinds of antagonisms, and further kind of fueling that fragmentation in a way. And so my hope would be they would come to a more to an approach that really tries to integrate that more and to kind of engage more in partnership. And I think this is also where the discussion is going, right? So I think initially the EU set out and it was very unilateral, our standards, and now I think they have, there was a lot of pressure as well, and I think we see the EU Commission also backpedaling now, and when we look at the kind of legal text of the EUDR, it also includes a kind of a statement of intent to really develop a strategic framework for cooperation also with the producer countries. So I think there are also some really bright spots here on the horizon. So yeah, perhaps I park the other question about jurisdictional approaches for now. Perhaps that is also something that comes back in the discussion. But I think you kind of mentioned a very important point there, that there's a lot of rhetoric there about inclusiveness and these things having more access points and being more inclusive and integrative. But then there's also a question of how this really plays out in practice. And we see also a lot of kind of elite compromising, as you described it, and often a more limited inclusiveness in practice really in these processes. But thank you so much for your comments.
Thank you both for starting off this discussion. It's been already quite interesting. We have some questions that are quite related to the discussion that has already been started. A lot of interest in the European Union Deforestation Regulation. Also in light of the letter that came out in the past couple of days from 17 developing and emerging economies, directly challenging the EUDR and basically saying what it will do against sustainability. So a couple of questions on this that I have from the audience are: one, do you think it can actually make a difference in the face of all this contestation and in the face of some of the other dynamics that you have both brought up so far today? And then another one is, do you see similar initiatives around the world, like the deforestation, like this regulation? Do you see them popping up in some of the other countries? Do you see them popping up in the global south, so-called global south, or is this quite a unique initiative? And then a third question that's now shifting away from the European Union Deforestation Regulation is if you have any insights to share about the implementation in the field of sustainability standards in the perspective of these global shifts. For instance, how actors relate to standards in the field as we know that their implementation depends on a variety of factors rather. And then finally, a question on what does uptake, this kind of goes back to what Elizabeth was saying earlier, but what does uptake tell us and what does it not tell us about the effectiveness of private governance and these private standards? What can we actually get from these uptake numbers? And does that tell us much about what's actually happening on the ground? What does that mean in terms of enforcement and actual implementation? So I think we'll start there, and that's probably going to take us right through to the end. So over to you.
Right, thank you so much for the questions. The first question was focused on the EU deforestation regulation and whether I think it can really make a difference at all. So overall, I really do welcome this development, I have to say. And I think this is something many scholars have called for a long time, right? So we have been in this world of private voluntary governance for the past 3 decades, really. And there has been progress and success has been achieved to some degree, but I think ultimately scholars have arrived at the conclusion that it also remains a limited mechanism. And I think the promise of these mandatory regulatory approaches is really now that it will raise the regulatory floor for all companies, right? Depending, of course, also on questions of policy design, right? This, I think, can go a long way. And we currently also do see a lot of new research emerging that is kind of really dissecting sort of the policy sausage making process of the EUDR and other supply chain laws, and discussing questions of, okay, what's the scope? Are direct and indirect suppliers included or not? And I think these are all really important questions. And I think if these policies are designed, they're really something to a positive development, really. At the same time, I think it is also here, we can also here learn really some lessons from the kind of broader analytical perspective outlined in this book, right? So that we also really have to mind the more macro-political economic context in which these policies are ultimately implemented and formulated, right? And Kari, you mentioned in your, when you kind of introduced the Q&A round, how there's this new letter by a coalition of Global South countries rejecting these laws. And I think this already kind of is very much a feature of the kind of more multipolar world order in which we live in now, and in which power is much more diffused. And I think approaches that we had in the past, where the kind of the global north, Europe and the US would set standards, and they would just travel through global supply chains and would address sustainability challenges on the ground. I think that is very much a world of the past, right? So I think we really have to get more accustomed to that more multipolar or polycentric world order. And there, I think it's very important when we look at how these supply chain regulations work and how they're introduced, that they're really being introduced in a spirit of collaboration. I think that's very important, right? And I think here the Commission made somewhat of a mistake initially, that it kind of phrased this in very unilateral terms. That there was sort of a spirit of, we need to kind of clean up our own house, our European supply chains. We need to kind of reach our decarbonization goals. And I think this kind of more limited approach really misses an important opportunity to really create knock-on effects in terms of policies and incentivizing actors to also ratchet up their national regulations and policies. So I think we should definitely go much more into that direction. But luckily, it also seems that the debate is moving more into that area. There was also a question about whether there are other similar initiatives, like public mandatory regulatory initiatives around the world. And to my knowledge, this is currently more a regulatory trend that is more limited to advanced economies. So there's the EU, but the UK also has a similar regulation. And also in the US, there are policy initiatives on this front. I think it's much more, I mean, I think the regulatory agenda, the policy agenda is much more behind still when we look, for instance, at India or China. So I think we are still nowhere near, you know, a comparable regulatory agenda in those economies. There was a question about implementation in the field. I mean, perhaps like one thought on this, I think what we do see in the field is sort of a bifurcation of supply chains, right? So there are supply chains that are certified, that are covered by these zero deforestation commitments. And as I also mentioned in my talk, these are often the supply chains that link or that feed into Europe and other advanced economies. But they're also supply chains and suppliers that feed into China, India, and in the domestic market. And there's also research showing that often these other supply chains have a higher deforestation risk or exposure associated to them. So I think this bifurcation is also really playing out in the landscapes between suppliers. So that's definitely how these kind of, you know, global market shifts then also really translate into the bifurcation of supply chains on the ground. And there was a last question about uptake and what does it really tell us about effectiveness. So I think when we think of kind of these market-based mechanisms, certification, but or also CDCs, I think market uptake is ultimately a necessary condition for their effectiveness or for them to have any behavioral or biophysical impact. But of course, it's not a sufficient condition, right? So you can also have uptake of a poorly designed standard, and then kind of the behavioral effect or the impact on the ground might be non-existent, right? So I think this is an important way of how to kind of think about uptake in kind of a broader effectiveness discourse. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I think we don't have any time for further questions. So I want to thank you both very much for joining us for this discussion and offering such an insightful presentation on your book. I think that it was very interesting for everyone here today. And thank you very much to Elizabeth for her very insightful comments and kicking off the discussion. Before leaving everyone today, for those who are here still, I would like to announce that the entire fall lineup of the EU Renew webinar series is announced at our website, which is eu-renew.eu. Our next webinars bring in Christina Davis on the geopolitics of international organizations, Ranjit Lal on the politics of performance in international institutions, Peter Trubowitz and Brian Burgoon on the fractures in Western liberal tradition, and Jean-Philippe Terrien and Vincent Pouliot on the patchwork of actors and processes in today's global governance. So we have quite a fall season lined up, and you can sign up for those at eu-renew.eu. So again, thank you to both of our speakers for joining us today. It was a real pleasure. And thank you to the audience for joining us with your questions.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.